So I guess the first thing to chat about is the health and safety requirements sort of post-lockdown. I guess over a lot of issues to do with the pandemic, there's guidance and there's actual law, but can you give us some indication of what the government is requiring employers to do now that we're being freed up a bit more to go back into the workplace?
Yeah. So in addition to the legal obligation that an employer has, the duty of care to the employer's employees to safeguard their health and safety, the government has published guidelines working safely during coronavirus, which they set out requirements for different types of employers. So there are a number of guidances. So there's one for construction sites, there's the guidance for offices, etc. And they set out a number of things. So there's an obligation to carry out a risk assessment prior to employees returning, and to figure out where the risks are for the transmission of the virus and what steps to take to limit that. The employer also has to establish systems for increased hand washing and sanitizing. They need to take all steps to ensure that their employees can work from home if possible. So that hasn't changed, over the last few weeks. And obviously there is still the obligation to maintain social distancing of some sort. I mean, there is a bit of confusion now as to what the actual distance is, but there is still an obligation to ensure that staff can be distanced from each other when carrying out their jobs. And where that isn't possible because of the work environment, the employer needs to take such steps that are reasonable to ensure that the transmission risk is kept low.
Okay, and I guess as part of that, it's probably more helpful that employers and employees communicate well. There's a sense of cooperation rather than anyone pointing to a sentence in a document or whatever. I guess cooperation, collaboration is the ideal scenario, as opposed to sort of, well, it doesn't, I shouldn't be told to do that, etc. Sort of confrontation, yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think in this particular kind of environment that we're all in, human emotions and fears are particularly high. So as much communication of fact and openness in communication is a good thing for employers to engender in the workplace. And the guidance also specifically states that the employer must put on their website the details of their risk assessment. If necessary, they need to consult with a trade union, they should consult with their staff. And I guess this is really just, as I said earlier, just to sort of encourage that openness in communication to assuage fears that generally arise out of not knowing what's what. Particularly times like this, as we've all seen, no one likes to feel that they're being, the truth is being withheld or information is being withheld. So openness is particularly key at this time, I would say.
And do you think, in slightly more general terms, maybe it's a good opportunity for employers to reevaluate the way they try? I mean, we've seen, I suppose, in the NHS, the sort of minimum paid and maybe not highly regarded, and suddenly they're the most important. I'm not saying there's maybe lifesavers in data center world, but clearly reevaluating how they look after their employees, and clearly there's the letter of the law and then there's the spirit of the law. Do you think that's perhaps something employers would do well to look at?
I think so. I think that, some of us have been fortunate coming through this pandemic without any huge losses. Financial losses are being suffered across the board. People have lost loved ones. People have lost aspects of their health because of the virus. And there's so many untold losses we still don't know. So I think that employers need to be aware that they may have individual employees who have suffered huge losses from this virus. There are also employees who will have suffered tremendous anxiety and depression as a result, not sure about their jobs, not sure about their partner's jobs, not sure about their kids' education. So I think this really is a time for employers to bring out their best human side, I think, in relating to their employees. I think something else to really consider is really the sort of welcome back to work plan. Is there going to be some requirement now for reorientation, some reinduction processes so that staff feel supported as they reintegrate to the workforce? Some people have been at home for several months now, working from home. Some people have not worked at all. And so I think that's something to think about. And then also just to sort of consider, in the coming months, how are you going to handle holiday requests? How are you going to handle the impact of returning to work on people's mental health? How are you going to handle the workload? There's also the issue of, there have been some businesses that have had to furlough some of their staff. So they've essentially been on leave, being paid, right? While others have had to work the same period of time, sometimes taking on extra responsibilities. That's going to bring up some issues in the workplace that employers need to be aware of. So I think flexibility, openness, awareness of individuals' concerns, and maybe just, depending on the size of your workforce, just introducing some sort of channel so that there is a clear sense of how employees can raise concerns, can bring to the attention of their line managers particular, issues that weigh upon them.
Okay, and I guess that you mentioned like the workforce in general, but there were clearly identified sort of the vulnerable categories, whether that's people with sort of high risk illness factors or folks looking after children, so the childcare issue.
Yeah.
I guess there's a particular duty for employers to make sure that those people aren't sort of victimized or disadvantaged in any way as people return to work.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There is a duty not to discriminate, and there's an obligation to make reasonable adjustments for certain individuals. So where you've got disabled employees, where you've got women who are pregnant and therefore particularly concerned, where you have staff that have had to shield. You might have an employee, you have no idea that they have an underlying condition because they never disclosed that to you. So that's something to handle sensitively. And just being mindful that although the lockdown measures have been loosened and continue to be loosened, some individuals might still be as terrified as they were right at the beginning. So again, I think it calls for that human side of the employer being aware of their legal obligations, but also what it means to individuals within their teams that they are living with this virus out there as a threat.
Moving on to a feature, I guess, of the pandemic has been the flexible working. Obviously, at one point we were all told to work at home if we possibly could. And I think that sort of advice is still somewhat out there, although, as you say, that the guidance is changed a little bit. So what, I guess, are there any sort of legal rights people have for flexible working? Or again, is it something that employers and employees need to try and help one another to reach a sensible, I guess obviously if you work in a data center actually, on servers and stuff, then you can't probably do that from home. But where there is that opportunity to work flexibly, what are the legal requirements and what's the sort of moral side of it as well, I guess?
Yeah, well, as you said, there's still the guidance is still in place. If you can work from home, you should. And employers should encourage that. So really look at the workforce. As you say, within a data center, there will be those who can work from home, but there will be those that can't. You also, of course, have to take into account those that want to return to work and how you'll handle that. In terms of the right to flexible working, there is a statutory right. So any employee who has 26 weeks of what's called continuous employment can make a request, and the request has to be handled reasonably. I think in the current circumstances, given that employees have managed, for the most part, to carry out their work at home, it's going to be very difficult for an employer to not take that into account when they consider the request. If this individual has managed to do their work well from home, it's very difficult to turn around now and say that they can't have that, that right granted. Beyond that, I think we've seen a number of organizations saying that they're going to institute working from home as a norm. So employers need to just consider the employees' wishes alongside with what they need as a business. And if it's not available to a particular employee to work from home, particularly where the schools are not back, they might be looking after an elderly or an unwell relative or family member. There are other options. You could ask them to take leave, family leave. You could ask them to take statutory leave rights, parental leave. and look at that. And again, always being mindful that you're not discriminating in your responses to individuals, and also being mindful of their mental health. Why are they asking to work from home? Is there something deeper that you need to be a little bit aware of, where maybe previously you didn't feel it was, relevant? People have been under immense pressure, and I think employers are minded to be aware of that.
And as people come back to work, there's obviously the possibility, although it appears to be reducing, day by day, that somebody at the workplace will come down with COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's probably advisable for employers to think about that scenario before it happens, rather than think, oh, goodness me, somebody's ill, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
Have a plan in place how they're going to manage that situation should it arise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is very important. I think employers should think in advance of what they would do. There would be a need to communicate to the rest of the staff, because there is an obligation to reduce and avoid transmission. So there's the risk to the other colleagues who've been in contact with that person. There will be a duty to perform extra, cleaning and hygiene processes to make sure that the risk of the risk of further transmission is reduced. And then also, some sort of track and trace, therefore, how will you figure out who was in contact with that individual? And how will you sort of spread that information, bearing in mind that, you have an obligation to protect the privacy of the employees. You wouldn't, in that situation, be revealing the individual's name. You would keep that confidential. But, figuring out how exactly you will go into identifying the risk to the other staff members and reducing the transmission risk. That's the essential obligation here.
Okay, and another thing I guess that's changed, people are coming back to the workplace, but the government's now offering a sort of flexible furlough, if I understand it correctly, so you can keep people furloughed, but they can come back and do some paid employment without losing that sort of furlough status and obviously the money from the government. I think 1st of July was a sort of date where it all changed. Can you, if it's easy to do, dare I say, characterise what, in simplest terms, what that change allows companies to do now?
Yes, I mean, the Chancellor has kept us on his toes with the scheme, changing it every so often over the last few months. So from the 1st of July, employers were allowed to bring employees back on a part-time basis. So on any terms that they agreed between themselves. So whether it was some sort of shifts, patterns, or reduced hours, whatever it was, they were allowed to come back and then claim under the scheme for the remaining unworked hours. And then sort of on a monthly basis thereafter till the end of October, the government is going to reduce the contribution. So from the 1st of August, employers will have to pay the employees' national insurance contributions and pension contributions. From September, the government will only reimburse 70%, and then from October, 60%. So they're sort of reducing and increasing, basically shifting the burden back to the employers. But the start has been, as you've rightly said, from the 1st of July, that employees can go back part-time, which previously was not allowed.
Okay, I mean, we covered a fair amount of ground there. Are there any sort of glaring gaps that we haven't covered, or just some, I guess, summary advice for both employers and employees as we move forward?
Yeah, I think that we are now probably going to enter into the territory of how does our workforce look post this pandemic? Once the government's support is removed, how are we going to afford to keep our staff? Are we going to have to make cuts? Are we going to have to reduce numbers? I think that's going to be a reality for a lot of employers. And so, thinking about how that can be done. Do you reduce costs by trying to get your employees to agree to reduce salaries or reduced working hours, and thereby keeping more of them? Do you have to contemplate redundancies, whereby you reduce the workforce sort of in a permanent way? And then just taking into account that both of those processes really would require some additional legal advice, because if you're going to make a certain number of redundancies, 20 or more anywhere, you need to consult officially with the employees. You need to inform the secretary. So, there's action to take, there's planning there, and then basically the process needs to be fair. so that you don't fall foul of statutory obligations and breach the employee's rights. But I think that's the biggest thing. I think that, in a sense, the coronavirus job retention scheme has put the job losses on hold. And I think employers are now probably going to have to look and consider quite hard decisions about with regard to their staff.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time spent chatting today. And thanks very much indeed.